Next, we have your learning outcomes. These are a few specific steps and goals for your lesson that you want your students to reach by the end of the lesson. If we're thinking of lesson planning, like planning an adventure or a road trip, then these learning outcomes are the different stops along your journey. Not just the final destination, but the multiple stops or multiple destinations along the way. This is one of those really technical parts of your lesson plan where it really matters what word you use to write that simple little line. But those things make all the difference, and it's things that we are paying attention to. So we want you to pay attention to this part of lesson planning. And if you can figure out how to make strong, measurable learning outcomes, then that is one key part of making an effective lesson plan. All right, so if you work in a large school or you've spent a fair amount of time working with a particular curriculum or standards or learning outcomes, or what you might instead call learning objectives or learning goals, then you're probably familiar with this kind of language right here. In fact, you may be used to seeing this exact language used in your learning outcomes. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to, and then some kind of measurable action verb and some additional details. This is very common language for educators to use when they're designing their learning outcomes. And we're going to show you how to use language that is very similar to this when designing your lesson plans. And this is going to be quite technical. And for many of you, it might be a little strange, a little foreign. It might be kind of difficult. But we have 3 simple rules to follow. And if you follow these simple rules, then it should be very easy for you to create the kind of learning outcomes that we expect from you for this TESOL course. In this technical language that we want you to use for your learning outcomes, this really is important for the TESOL course and for meeting all the requirements that you need to meet in order to get your TESOL certificate. And some of you may never have to create your own learning outcomes after the TESOL course. However, this is a great skill to develop. It will not only make you a better lesson planner, it will make you a better teacher. You'll understand the learning process better, and it also has great applications if you ever want to go on and create your own curriculum for your ministry or your teaching location. This is a great skill to have. So yes, we are going to get technical with our learning outcomes, and it's going to take some effort on your part in order to get comfortable doing this. But don't forget that this will make you a better teacher in so many ways, and we have 3 simple rules for creating your learning outcomes that should help you. So let's get into those 3 rules. So rule number 1 is we want you to follow this specific model when creating your learning outcomes. Again, this is a standard model that's used by many educators and curriculum designers. It's all about thinking about your destination. By the end of this lesson, what do you want your students to be able to do, and what kind of language do you use in order to measure the learning that they are doing? And you can use this exact model here. By the end of this lesson, students will be able to a measurable action verb and then some more details. Or since we're kind of short on space, in this box and on most lesson plan templates, we're going to recommend a slightly abbreviated version of this phrase right here. So to abbreviate this, we're going to get rid of the first part of the phrase. And I'm also going to abbreviate the word students to just a large S and a small s. So our new phrase is that students will be able to a measurable action verb and then some additional details. Now by additional details, I mean specific details that explain how your students will accomplish the learning in this activity. So these details are about how the students will learn. I want to draw your attention to that. And this action verb needs to be measurable. I want to draw your attention to that as well. So let's get into some practical examples of what this looks like in our animals lesson plan. So here are some examples. Students will be able to identify 9 animal pictures using appropriate vocabulary and pronunciation. This is the learning outcome for the first P, the presentation, in our animals lesson, where the teacher presents 9 animal pictures to the students, and through the activity, the students will be able to identify all 9 of those animal pictures using the correct vocabulary, the correct animal name, and they'll practice pronunciation at the same time. Our next learning outcome is that students will be able to describe animals using ing verbs in simple sentences. This describes the learning that our students are doing in the practice section of this lesson during the tic-tac-toe activity, during which the students describe the animals using these ing verbs. And then finally, our last learning outcome is students will be able to discuss animals at the zoo using language appropriate for their level of English. And this describes the learning that happens in the final P, or the production of our animal lesson, where we've created a role play with a real life situation where the students are at the zoo and they're discussing the animals that they see at the zoo using whatever language is appropriate for their level. So rule number 1 is to use this model. And as you can see, all 3 of our learning outcomes follow this model. They all begin with students will be able to. They all use a measurable action verb, and we'll talk more about this in just a sec, but you can see that each of these learning outcomes use words like identify, describe, and discuss. And then they contain specific details that don't just explain what the activity is, but they try to shed light on how the students are doing this activity. So in this example, the students aren't just identifying pictures by pointing at them, but we have some specific details here. They're identifying 9 animal pictures, and they're using pronunciation. They're using appropriate vocabulary, so we can tell that the students are speaking in this activity. There are a lot of different ways to add specific details to your learning outcomes, but the point is be specific and be detailed. Don't try to just describe what the activity is. Try to add enough specific details that you can shed light on how the students are doing this activity. In the other examples, we can see that the students aren't just describing animals, but they're describing animals using ing verbs, and they're speaking in full sentences, albeit simple ones. And so rule number 1 for making your learning outcomes is to follow this example here. We recommend this very strict way to begin your learning outcomes. And then you have quite a bit of leeway here on how to finish your learning outcome. However, we want you to be specific, detailed, and to try to explain how your students are accomplishing the learning that's happening in this activity. So now let's look at our second rule. This rule focuses in on this part of our learning outcome and how we make our learning outcomes measurable. And it comes down to the type of word that we use. So not only do we want you to use a verb here, but it needs to be some kind of action verb. It needs to show action that is happening inside your classroom. But it also needs to be a measurable action verb, or another way to say this is that it needs to be observable. So when you're writing your learning outcomes, you need to use language that shows some kind of observable action that your students are doing. This word needs to be something that you'll be able to see or hear your students doing in the classroom. You need to be able to hear them say something, or see them write something, or see them do something in your classroom. And so in our three examples here, our students are identifying these animal pictures by speaking and using correct pronunciation and by using the correct animal name. Or they're describing the animals using ing verbs in full, complete sentences and doing that correctly. And then they're discussing these animals in a real life situation, in a conversation, using whatever additional language they have that is appropriate to their level. So in these three examples, these are all things that as a teacher, I can listen to my students speaking and I can measure whether or not they are accomplishing these learning outcomes in these three different activities in my lesson. Another way to think about this is the type of language that we don't want you to use for your learning outcomes. So some examples of words that are not measurable action verbs would be words such as students will be able to know, students will be able to understand, or students will be able to learn. These are three common words that teachers will put into their learning outcomes. However, all of these words are just invisible things that happen inside the student's brain that we cannot observe. We cannot see or hear what a student knows or understands or learns. These words are not observable. These words are not measurable. And so we need to instead find some kind of measurable action verb that we can see or that we can hear. And we're going to use that kind of language instead in writing our learning outcomes. This might seem way too technical, but it's actually a great thing as a teacher to look for observable, measurable learning in your classroom. To not just assume that your students know or understand or they are learning, but to create activities and to specifically look for measurable evidence that your students are actually knowing and understanding and learning. So rule number 2 is that we don't just want you to follow this model, but we want you to use measurable action verbs in your learning outcomes. And finally, rule number 3 is that your learning outcomes need to match your activities and vice versa. So you need to make sure that each learning outcome accurately represents an activity in your lesson and that the activity actually achieves its learning outcome. It goes both ways. The learning outcome must match the activity, and that activity must match its learning outcome. It is very common for teachers to create a learning outcome for their lesson and then to design an activity to achieve that learning outcome, but somewhere in the creative process of planning the lesson, the activity develops into something that no longer achieves the specific learning outcome that I wrote down in this section of my lesson plan. So an example of this could be seen here. So perhaps while I am planning my lesson, I create a learning outcome where I expect to get my students to discuss the animals at the zoo, to have a conversation here. But that's somewhere in my creative process while I'm actually writing my lesson plan, that this conversational discussion turns instead into a written activity where my students are writing about the animals at the zoo instead of discussing them. If this learning outcome says that my students will be able to discuss animals at the zoo, but then the actual activity I do in my classroom is that I have my students writing about animals at the zoo, then that learning outcome and that activity, they don't match. And because lesson planning can take so much time for you as a teacher, it's possible for you to get off track and to design activities for your students that don't actually match the learning outcome that you have here in your lesson plan. And so this is something that we're going to be paying attention to. We are going to be making sure that the language that you use, not only is it measurable, but does it actually match the activities that you wrote later in your lesson. And rule number 3 is to make sure that the learning outcome matches the activity and that the activity matches the learning outcome. And that's simply done with a quick double check. to proofread your lesson plan and to make sure before you're done that the learning outcomes and the activities match and that they accurately represent each other. And so these are the 3 rules for writing learning outcomes. We want you to follow this model to make sure you use a measurable action verb, not words such as know, understand, or learn. And you make sure that by the time you're done with your lesson plan, this learning outcome actually matches the activities that you plan and write out in your lesson plan. Now, in addition to these 3 rules, I also want to give you some more advice. And the first bit of advice I have is to begin at the end. We begin planning our lessons not by planning our activities, but by thinking about these, our learning outcomes, our destinations, and the things that we want to be able to see or hear our students doing in the lesson. Now, some teachers don't do this. They don't start by planning their learning outcomes. They just simply start creating activities. And then when they're all done with their activities, they write learning outcomes to match those activities. But actually, a more efficient way, a better way to plan your lesson is to start here. To begin with the end, to begin your lesson planning by writing out your learning outcomes. Let me give you a few examples of why this works and how it works. So if I have an hour for my lesson, let's say, and I know that I need to get to such and such a point by the end of it, then I will begin by thinking about this destination. What do I want my students to be able to know or to do at the end of this lesson? And I will work my way backward from there. It's sort of like reverse engineering something. So if you're using a course book during your lessons, then perhaps you'll choose one learning outcome for each of the sections of the unit that you're covering in class today. So I want my students to be able to understand this vocabulary. And then we're going to practice our pronunciation. And then we're going to do some listening activities. After that, we have some reading that we're going to do. Then it looks like we have a conversational sort of interview activity that we need to do from our course book. And then we have some review. So if I'm using a course book during my lesson, I'm not going to start by just thinking about what types of activities I want to do. I'm going to start here. I'm going to start by thinking about the different sections of this unit in my course book, and I'm going to create learning outcomes for each of those sections. So that's another way to begin at the end. Now, if you don't have a course book, and if you're just planning a lesson from scratch, kind of the way that we did with our animals lesson, where I just have a topic and I need to create a lesson around that topic, then perhaps by beginning at the end, I'm going to create one learning outcome for each of the skills that I want my students to practice in the lesson. So I'm going to create a learning outcome for listening, for pronunciation, for speaking, for writing, and so on. Or if I'm using PPP or a similar framework to plan my lesson, then perhaps I'll create one learning outcome for each of the P's in my PPP lesson. And as you can see, that's what I did here. I create a learning outcome for my presentation, a learning outcome for my practice section of my lesson, and a learning outcome for my production section of my lesson plan. So this is a way to begin at the end if I don't have a course book and if I'm just creating my lessons from scratch or based on a particular topic. And so that's this tip that I want to give you, is to begin not by simply jumping in and planning out whatever activities you want to do today as a teacher because you'll think they'll be fun or you think your students will like them, but to really think through, what destinations do I want to reach with my class today? Where are we going? Let's plan those out by writing a simple learning outcome for each of those things that I want to accomplish. And then for each of these learning outcomes, I'm going to plan an activity. It might seem technical, but this is a much more efficient and effective way to plan your lesson. And so that's why we have our learning outcomes right at the top of the lesson plan and why we have you do those first. Now, another tip I want to give you is something that might help you find the right kind of measurable action verbs to use for your lesson plan. And that is a resource that's been used by teachers for many generations. It's something called Bloom's Taxonomy. And this is a taxonomy, or a set of language that was created by Benjamin Bloom and his team of teachers and theorists and psychologists back in the 1950s. And it's been refreshed over time, it's been changed slightly, but it does a great job of visualizing learning. And in this example of Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy, we can visualize learning as a pyramid. Learning happens this way. It's a set of cognitive skills, or it's abilities that students have. And some of them are lower order skills, such as just remembering and understanding content. And then based on that foundation, we move up the pyramid in our learning, up to higher order cognitive skills and abilities, such as the ability to apply information, analyze, evaluate, and eventually even create. So before I can understand a concept, or in our example using the animals lesson, before I can understand what a giraffe is, I just need to remember the word giraffe. If I can't remember the word, I'm not going to be able to understand it. And then moving up the pyramid, in order to be able to apply a concept, I need to be able to first understand it. In order to evaluate something, I first need to have analyzed it. So in our animals lesson, during the role play, our advanced students have to discuss the moral dilemma of animals living in cages versus animals living in the wild. And so in order to make that kind of evaluation, in order to defend their positions, they need to remember the animals' names, to understand what they are. They need to apply that vocabulary to a specific situation and to have analyzed those animals living in cages versus animals living in the wild before they can make a stand and give their evaluation. This is a higher order thinking skill or cognitive skill than just simply remembering or understanding the names of animals. And then finally, to create something brand new that's all your own, that gives an accurate conclusion of what you think and feel about something, you need to have evaluated it. And that means you need to have done all these other things. And so this is Bloom's taxonomy, and it gives us this great visual of how learning happens inside our students. And there are a lot of applications here, and you may already see how this could apply to lesson planning and how it could be useful to you as a teacher when you're sitting down and you're planning your lesson and you're writing your learning outcomes. Now, if you just searched Google right now for Bloom's taxonomy, there's a good chance you'll find older versions of his taxonomy that don't have these verbs here. Instead, they have nouns. And that's because Benjamin Bloom's original taxonomy used nouns instead of verbs. But in the early 2000s, another group of teachers and theorists and psychologists updated his original taxonomy to use verbs instead of nouns. And this can be very helpful to us when we're planning our lessons, because now this gives us a set of language, a taxonomy, that we can then use to create our learning outcomes. And so already you can see, if I'm working on the presentation part of my PPP lesson and I just want to present vocabulary to my students that they will be able to remember and understand, then this gives me a set of verbs that I can use when writing my learning outcome. And as I move through the 3 P's of my PPP lesson and I get my students to practice what they remember and understand, I have a set of verbs here that I can use to get my students to apply what they learned during the presentation or to analyze a particular situation or to make an evaluation about something. And as I move through my lesson and eventually get my students to produce the language from the presentation portion of my lesson, I have a large set of measurable action verbs here to plan activities that use those kinds of higher order thinking skills. And so if you're ever having a hard time thinking of what little word do I use when looking for that measurable action verb to include in my learning outcome, you can look at this pyramid for some recommendations. Think about, where are my students on this pyramid during this activity? And do some of these words help describe the kind of learning that they're doing? And then insert one of these words in your learning outcome. All right, so this is Bloom's taxonomy. It can be a great tool for finding measurable language to use in your learning outcomes, and it can just be a great guide for understanding and visualizing what learning looks like. You're not required to use this when writing your learning outcomes, but we do know that many people find it helpful, so we want to recommend it to you and make sure that you're aware of this amazing resource. All right, let's finish with a quick recap plus a few other details and things to think about. Now, we presented 3 rules for you to follow when writing your learning outcomes. The first rule is to use this model here. The second rule has to do with making sure your learning outcome is measurable. So to do that, avoid using language such as students will be able to know, understand, learn, and other types of invisible words that you really can't observe. But instead use measurable action verbs to make your learning outcomes measurable. And the third rule is to make sure that each of these learning outcomes accurately represents an activity in your lesson and that that activity achieves its learning outcome. So make sure that these learning outcomes and the activities you plan, that they all match. And lastly, a few other details that we haven't covered up to this point, but that are also relevant, especially if you're writing learning outcomes for a 1-hour lesson, which many of you will do for your teaching portfolio. So a 1-hour lesson will typically have a minimum of 3 or more main activities in it. And so that means that a 1-hour lesson should typically have 3 or more learning outcomes. So although we give space for 5 learning outcomes, you don't need to create 5 outcomes for each lesson. However, we are expecting to see several, at least 3 or more for an hour-long lesson. That would be a norm that we are expecting. And finally, warm-up activities and wrap-up activities do not require a learning outcome, since the intended purpose of warm-ups is simply for the student to get ready to learn, and the purpose of wrap-up activities is for students to review and reflect back on what they learned. So typically students should not be learning something new during the warm-up and the wrap-up, and therefore no learning outcome is needed for those activities. If you happen to create one for one of these activities, it's probably not going to get used against you in any sort of negative way, as long as you follow those 3 rules. But I find that it is nice to know that you can skip creating learning outcomes for those warm-ups and those wrap-ups. So that is all we have for learning outcomes in this technical and detailed part of the lesson planning process. And as you look down the lesson plan template, next you will see 2 boxes. But normally we want you to skip these 2 boxes and start planning your activities next using the 5 columns and basing these activities off of the learning outcomes that you just created. And then we will come back to these 2 boxes that you see here later in the lesson planning process. And as always, if you think there's something you missed in this particular tutorial, then go back, watch this video again, and practice writing these measurable learning outcomes.